Thank you very much. Mirth moment?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I thought of a rather irreverent one this morning, which I did share. It has to do with letting go, admittedly, releasing and letting go. But little Jimmy was in school and he was having kind of a bad time. One of the kids was bullying him. And he came home to his mom, who naturally was a Unity student. And he said, "Mom, what am I going to do? This kid is bullying me." And she said, "Well, you know, he's smaller than you and you don't have to accept what he's doing. Why don't you release him and let him go?" And she explained what she meant by that. And Jimmy sort of nodded and he took that in, she thought, and he went back to school the next day, came home around 3 o'clock, so excited, "Mom, Mom, Mom, it worked. That kid I was telling you about. Well, I did. I released him and let him go. You know that filthy, smelly old pond outside the school gate? I took him out there and I released him and I let him go right over it." Plan B. What is Plan B? Now, some of you may remember probably the worst B movie ever made. In black and white about 50 years ago. It was called Plan B from Mars. Do you remember that one? It was truly terrible, and even the flying saucers were saucers. You knew somebody had thrown them. Oh, it was bad. But it was the second feature at the drive-in, so you could be reasonably sure nobody saw it. But my wife and I did see it at the 63rd Street Drive-In in Kansas City. We saw it, Plan B from Mars. It was reliably said at that time in Kansas City that half the marriages contracted in that city had their origins in the 63rd Street Drive-In, but such was not the case with my wife and me because we were already married. But I have never forgotten Plan B from Mars, and Plan B, to me today, as I'm going to suggest it to you and introduce it to you, is the third option that we have when we're confronted with the possibility of conflict in our lives. Let's remember that as human beings, we were born centuries and millennia ago into conflict in many instances. We had to fight. The Old Testament is filled with stories of confrontation. Murder on a grand scale, you might say. Many of the other scriptures in other religions are similar. The sword is taken up, and your enemies are slain in their hecatombs. I'm not entirely sure how many in a hecatomb, but you'd have to look it up. But certainly a lot. And if you can't slay them, you run. Fight or flight. If you can't bash them, you run like hell. So these were the alternatives available to us as human beings. Things supposedly grew a little more subtle over the years and centuries, and much of that external activity, the violence and the flight, became internalized. In other words, our confrontations developed a psychological perspective. Much of the fight and the flight took place and began to take place within ourselves. Some studies done not too long ago by several leading universities suggested, and I think very truly, that an enormous amount of damage is done when we suppress and repress. The two are distinct. When we suppress and repress our desires to fight, literally, and our desires to flee. We can't take up a sword as a rule and bash the person that we would like to. We can't flee. How can we leave our mortgages, our car payments, and run away? We'd love to, but we can't. So we're stuck. And so everything becomes internalized. The whole fight-flight scenario becomes internalized. Of course, it does still occur outside of ourselves. We know that there are many causes in the world today that are being literally fought for. Some of them we think justly. And there are other flights that are taking place. Look at the massive number. And it's going to get greater and greater of immigrants who are fleeing violence, poverty, hunger, despair. So fight and flight are still very much with us. But individually speaking, which is the perspective from which I want to come this morning, individually speaking, the third alternative, Plan B, is something that we may choose to employ in our own dealings with life. So what does it mean? Essentially, what Jesus told us it meant, non-resistance. And it's terribly hard for us sometimes to understand that whole notion of non-resistance. Jesus says in Scripture, he tells us, and he tells his disciples on several occasions, he says, you have learned and you were told, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But what I tell you is this, resist not the man who wrongs you. Non-resistance. In the Garden of Gethsemane, in the very last hours of his earthly life, and as we come up to Easter, we remember that, Jesus had an opportunity to fight those who came to arrest him or to flee. He could easily have fled. He could have spent the rest of his life in a glorious retirement villa in Corsica or Cyprus or somewhere like that in the Mediterranean. What a great idea. I don't think they had condos in those days, but you know. He certainly could have fled. And look, his disciples were ready to defend him. One of them cut off the ear of a guard, and Jesus says right there, put up your sword. Put up your sword. Don't do this. What incredible spiritual and moral courage it took for him to persist in that teaching in the very face of his own presumed extinction. What would you do? What would I do? Well, I'd probably fight for my life or run like hell. Wouldn't that be the sensible thing to do? And he just waits there. Is this cowardice? Or is it moral and spiritual courage of the most unimaginable sort? Jesus is no coward. He's a strong man. You don't do what he did. You don't wander throughout hostile countryside alone very often or with a few disciples as he did, unless you're pretty tough. Pretty tough. Really. So we've got a strong man here. And yet he says, don't resist. And when the end comes, he says, no, don't resist, because he knows that his spiritual truth, his spiritual integrity, his spiritual identity, his oneness with God shall be vindicated through such a stand. He has the courage and the bravery to do that. Is that martyrdom? Did he seek martyrdom? I don't know. Depends on your point of view, I suppose. But to me, he had the moral and spiritual courage to do what he tells us to do. Now, many, many people like to tell us what to do, don't they? Especially teachers of religion. But are they willing to do it themselves? Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. Jesus indubitably was. He said, okay, try me. Because Plan B worked for him. Now, let's be clear. Non-resistance is not necessarily passive resistance. The great Mahatma Gandhi taught his followers forms of resistance that were sometimes condemned because they appeared to involve some sort of passive aggression. For example, he could have his disciples paralyze all the railroads in India just by lying on the railroad lines. It was a very effective kind of a militant action, which was construed as non-resistance, but was really, in many ways, passive aggression or passive resistance. Now, he knew the difference very clearly between that form of protest and true non-resistance. He had a name, Satyagraha, which means soul force, which told people how to practice that. But he was interested in the practice of that more on an individual basis. And I think this is where the truth of this whole teaching lies. It really is a matter of individual preference and choice. This is when it comes down to the personal, intimate spiritual discoveries we make concerning life. Are we going to resist in some form or another? Are we going to lie across a railroad? Or are we going to strike, perhaps, in our modern society and refuse to go to work? Is that true non-resistance? Non-resistance is really more subtle than that. It involves removing oneself entirely from any form of encounter that can be construed as obstructive or threatening in any way. It is immensely difficult to practice. Let's not fool ourselves. But it can be remarkably beneficial to us from a psychological standpoint and a spiritual standpoint too. I gave an illustration this morning of how I'd practiced, I thought, non-resistance in a threatening situation. And believe me, it doesn't come naturally to me. I'm a pretty scrappy guy. I was quite hot-tempered when I was young. I was ready to take anybody on. Come on, try me, all that aggression, male aggression. I don't know what it was, but I was scrappy. And, of course, when it came to running away, I was prepared to do that too. If there were two guys instead of one, where's the exit? So, a little element of cowardice is sometimes self-preservative, but we're talking about something very different here. We're talking about a moral and a spiritual decision that one takes not to become involved in somebody else's agenda of violence and provocation. Very, very, very hard thing to do because we think, well, somehow we've failed. We're going to be judged. We're moral. Was Jesus a moral coward in the garden? I don't think so. But I told the story this morning of what happened to me in California some years ago. It was a road rage incident. This guy was driving a truck and he'd been dodging in and out. And he finally slammed on the brakes, and I nearly hit him. I came to a stop. He got out of the cab. If this had been Florida, he'd have reached for the glove compartment and pulled out his .38, but he didn't, fortunately. And he came out, and he came right up, and he was threatening, yelling, and I don't know whether he was drunk or not. He was just angry. You cut me out, you cut me. Well, I don't know whether I did or not. He thought I did. And I thought, well, what do I do? Do I sort of hit him? Do I sort of aim for his equipment and immobilize him or something? Or do I run and leave the car in the middle of the highway and run down into the... Maybe he could run faster than me. I was a pretty good runner in those days. But I chose, in that moment, non-resistance, total non-resistance. I put my hands up in that universal gesture that we see sometimes adopted for those who don't wish to engage. I just did this. And it kind of blew his mind. I think he was really looking forward to something or other. And he shook his head and he muttered some obscenities. And believe me, I'm pretty used to being called just about anything. In my career, I've encountered, not gentlemen, but I've encountered those who have found me less than credible and explained it to me in rather vivid terms. I was once a chaplain at the state penitentiary in Kansas, so I can tell you. But he just didn't know what to do. He stood there and you could see the poor guy you know, it was sort of like, I felt sorry for him, actually. He was looking forward to it. And he just sort of defeated, and he turned around, got in the cab, and drove off. Now, I took a chance, because he could have flattened me. I probably would have done, but it's a trivial incident. It's a trivial incident, you know, just one of those things that happens in some states on your way to work just about every morning. But I was aware of it because in life many times I've asked myself, should I adopt the non-resistance stance? Is this something that I want to do? It's usually with something a little more sophisticated than a violent, personal, potentially physical encounter. That's a dramatic way of illustrating it. But usually it happens on a psychological level. I want to fight somebody. I really feel I need to fight somebody. Or they think they need to fight me. Or I'm threatened by somebody and I want to run away from them because I don't like that. And I'm frightened about fighting them, but I don't want to stay around, so I think about running. The fight or flight mechanism is still alive in us, folks. It's part of our, I nearly said, animal heritage. It's been built into us genetically. It's part of our self-preservative, instinctual response to life. Fight or flight. But wait a minute. Jesus lived in one of the most violent societies that we can imagine. Really. I mean, we look at that part of the world today and we say, oh, there's a lot of violence. Nothing compared to what Jesus experienced. The Romans alone were brutal. Brutal. They'd flog you to death just for winking. They'd crucify you if you said the wrong thing. My goodness, you know, it's sort of, there was no one to come to your rescue. In fact, prophets of Jesus' ilk, Jewish prophets, were capable of raising armies to fight the invaders and, incidentally, one another. It's always fun to have a bash at one another while you're at it. So, you know, he was no stranger to unimaginable violence of a physical sort. Well, as I say, over the years, much of what we encounter by way of fight or flight response has become internalized. You say to me, are there not good causes worth fighting for? Yes. Is it not prudent sometimes to run away? Probably. I'm not here to advocate a point of view, folks. I'm not telling you, mercifully in unity we don't have any doctrine or dogma, so I'm not obliged to tell you what to do. Praise God, you can make your own minds up. But I'm saying, isn't it possible that this idea of non-resistance can be, and I nearly said, a weapon in our armory, which shows you how deeply imbued we are with the fight response, doesn't it? But seriously, the non-resistance option, plan B, can be part of our response to living. I don't think there are many of us here today who haven't had aggressive thoughts about something or somebody, possibly in the recent past. I'm sure there are some of us here who have said, oh my God, I wish I could run away. Haven't you said that? I've said both those things in the last 2 or 3 months. We all do. But somehow standing one's ground quietly and refusing to become involved in that agenda of fear or violence or flight. Nietzsche, the great German philosopher of the end of the 19th century, said this was evidence of the weak morality of Christianity. He said, oh no, we need to be Übermensch, Superman, so that we can smash and crush our opponents. Well, it's a wonderful idea for the Nazis, of course, who took up his ideas. Or we can even run away. He never said that. He was of the smashing forward variety. Poor Nietzsche, bless his heart, he died in a Swiss nursing home. But that's beside the point. But I say, isn't this really something to consider to preserve our own spiritual integrity and peace of mind? Isn't it part of a learning process? Jesus once turned to one of his disciples who was complaining and urging him on to be aggressive. And he said, what is that to thee? What is that to thee? What is that to thee? Don't we have our own business to be about, which is the discovery of this deep, loving, central force within ourselves, which represents acceptance, compassion, cooperation, love even. Sometimes, isn't it a wise idea to think of plan B and to be completely just non-aggressive and non-fearful and say, no, thank you very much. I choose not to participate in this particular drama. You can count me out. Non-resistance, non-resistance. Thank you very much. It's an option. Why not? Now I'll shut up.